A young woman is given away like property to a Viking warrior to pay for her father's shameful debt. But what the warrior does next is something no one could have predicted. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The cold wind swept across the Norwegian fjord with a ferocity that seemed to cut through flesh and bone alike. It was the autumn of 872, and the settlement of Bjørnstad stood nestled between towering cliffs and the dark, churning waters of the North Sea. The longhouses clustered together like sheep seeking warmth, their thatched roofs weighted down with stones against the relentless coastal storms. Smoke rose from the central hearths, curling into the gray sky where seabirds wheeled and cried their haunting songs. In one of the smaller longhouses on the eastern edge of the settlement, Astrid, Thorvald's daughter, sat by the fire, her slender fingers working steadily at the loom before her. The wool thread passed through her hands with practiced ease, creating patterns that her mother had taught her since childhood. At 20 years of age, Astrid had grown into a woman of remarkable beauty, though she carried herself with a humility that seemed almost out of place in an era where boldness was valued above all else. Her hair fell in waves of golden honey down her back, and her eyes held the color of the summer sky, clear and bright even in the dim light of the longhouse. Her features were delicate yet strong, with high cheekbones and a gentle curve to her lips that suggested kindness rather than the hardness that survival in these northern lands often demanded. Astrid's father, Thorvald the Coward, as he had come to be known throughout the settlement, sat in the shadows near the far wall. His shoulders were hunched, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a wooden cup filled with ale. Once he had been a respected farmer and fisherman, but a series of poor decisions and a moment of weakness during a raid 3 summers past had destroyed his reputation entirely. When the warriors of Bjørnstad had sailed south to claim what was theirs from a rival settlement, Thorvald had hidden in the hold of the ship, paralyzed by fear when the battle began. His cowardice had been witnessed by many, and though he had not been cast out, he might as well have been. No man would trade with him fairly, no woman would speak to his daughter in the marketplace, and the weight of shame had turned him bitter and desperate. The sound of heavy footsteps outside made Astrid look up from her weaving. Her heart quickened with apprehension, for visitors to their household were rare and seldom brought good news. The door burst open, and 3 men entered without invitation, their massive frames filling the doorway and blocking out what little light remained of the dying day. At their head stood Jarl Erik Bloodaxe, the chieftain of Bjørnstad, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him like the prow of a warship cutting through fog. Erik was a warrior in his 40th year, still powerful and commanding despite the silver that had begun to thread through his dark beard. His eyes were hard as flint, and a scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from a battle in his youth that had only added to his fearsome appearance. Behind him stood 2 of his herdmen, his sworn warriors, each armed with axes and wearing leather armor reinforced with iron rings. Thorvald scrambled to his feet, nearly dropping his cup in his haste. "Jarl Erik," he stammered, his voice cracking with nervousness. "This is an unexpected honor." "Please sit, let me offer you—" "Silence," Erik commanded, his voice like iron scraping against stone. He did not sit. Instead, he surveyed the humble interior of the longhouse with obvious disdain, his gaze lingering on the threadbare furs, the meager stores of food hanging from the rafters, the general air of poverty that had settled over the household like dust. When his eyes finally settled on Astrid, they narrowed slightly, and something like calculation flickered in their depths. "I have come regarding a debt, Thorvald, a debt that has gone unpaid for far too long." Astrid felt ice form in her stomach. She set down her weaving carefully, her hands suddenly cold despite the warmth of the fire. She had known this day would come. Her father had borrowed silver from the Jarl 2 winters ago, silver that was meant to purchase livestock and seed for planting. Instead, Thorvald had spent it on ale and dice games, desperately trying to win back some measure of respect from men who would never grant it to him. The debt had grown with interest, and now stood at a sum that her father could never hope to repay in 3 lifetimes. "My Jarl, I beg your patience," Thorvald pleaded, dropping to his knees in a gesture that made Astrid look away in shame. "I need but a few more months. The fishing will improve in the spring, and I can—" "The time for patience has long passed," Erik interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "You have had 2 years, Thorvald. 2 years in which you have paid back nothing, not a single piece of hack silver, not a single sheep or measure of grain. Your promises are as worthless as your courage." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air like smoke. "However, I am not without mercy. I am prepared to consider your debt settled, but you will give me something of value in return." Thorvald's face, already pale, turned the color of old parchment. "I have nothing left of value, my Jarl. The land barely produces enough to keep us from starving. The fishing nets are old and torn. I have no livestock worth speaking of, no—" "You have a daughter," Eric said flatly, and now his gaze moved fully to Astrid, studying her with the same cold assessment a man might give to a horse he was considering purchasing. "She is young, healthy, and from what I can see, not unpleasant to look upon. She will serve as payment for your debt." The word struck Astrid like a physical blow. She stood slowly, her legs feeling weak beneath her, but she forced herself to remain steady. She had always known that her fate would likely be decided by men, by the needs of survival and the harsh realities of their world, but she had not imagined it would come to this, to be traded like a piece of property, to be given away to settle her father's shame. "Please, my Jarl," Astrid heard herself say, her voice stronger than she felt. "My father's debts are not mine. I have worked honestly. I have caused no trouble. Surely there must be another way." Eric's expression did not soften. "There is no other way. Your father cannot pay, and justice must be served. However, I am not taking you for myself, girl. I have no need of another woman in my household." He gestured to one of the warriors behind him, and the man stepped forward into the firelight. Astrid's breath caught in her throat. The warrior who emerged from the shadows was unlike any man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the doorway entirely. His arms were thick with muscle, marked with the scars of countless battles, and his hands looked capable of crushing stone. He wore his dark hair long, pulled back from his face and bound with leather cords, and his beard was neatly braided in the fashion of the northern warriors. But it was his eyes that captured her attention most, pale gray like the sea on a winter morning, and in them she saw something she had not expected, a depth of intelligence and restraint that seemed at odds with his brutal appearance. "This is Bjorn Ironside," Eric announced, using the warrior's by-name with a note of pride. "He is my best fighter, the strongest man in my herd, and he has served me faithfully for 10 years. He has earned a reward, and he has chosen to accept your daughter as his thrall, to work in his household and serve his needs. This will settle your debt entirely, Thorvald. You should count yourself fortunate that I am willing to accept this arrangement rather than taking your worthless head." Thrall. The word echoed in Astrid's mind with horrible finality. A slave. She would become a slave to this warrior, bound to serve him in whatever capacity he demanded, with no rights and no freedom. The fate of thralls in Viking society was well known. They were property, to be used and discarded at their master's whim. Some were treated with a measure of kindness, but many suffered terribly, especially the women. Thorvald, still on his knees, did not even look at his daughter. "Yes, my Jarl," he whispered, his voice hollow. "Yes, the debt is settled. Take her." The betrayal cut deeper than any blade could have. Astrid had known her father was weak, had known he was ruled by fear and shame, but she had not truly believed he would sacrifice her so easily. She looked at him now, this broken man who had given her life, and felt something inside her heart turn to stone. "Father," she said quietly, and the word held more accusation than any shout could have conveyed. Thorvald finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and for a moment she saw grief there, mixed with the shame, but he said nothing. He simply looked away again, unable to bear the weight of what he had done. Bjorn Ironside stepped forward, his movements surprisingly graceful for such a large man. When he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, lacking the cruelty that Astrid had expected. "Gather your belongings," he told her, not unkindly. "Whatever you wish to bring you may take. I will not have it said that I dragged a woman from her home with nothing but the clothes on her back." Astrid wanted to refuse, wanted to fight, but she knew it would be useless. She was one woman against 3 armed warriors and a chieftain. If she resisted, they would simply take her by force, and her dignity would be lost along with her freedom. Better to walk out of this house with her head held high than to be carried out screaming and struggling. She moved to the corner where she kept her few possessions. There was a wooden chest that had belonged to her mother. filled with the winter clothes she had woven herself, a silver brooch that had been her grandmother's, and a small knife with a bone handle that she used for her handwork. She gathered these things carefully, wrapping them in a woolen cloak. Her hands were steady, though her heart was racing. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break down. Not here, not in front of the father who had betrayed her. As she worked, she could feel Bjorn's gaze upon her, but when she glanced in his direction, his expression was unreadable. He was not leering at her the way some men did, nor did he seem particularly pleased with his new acquisition. If anything, he looked almost uncomfortable, though it was hard to tell with a man whose face seemed carved from granite. When she had finished gathering her belongings, Astrid turned to face her father one last time. Thorvald still knelt by the fire, his head bowed, refusing to meet her eyes. She wanted to say something, to curse him or beg him to reconsider, but the words would not come. What could be said that would change anything? He had made his choice, and now she would have to live with the consequences. "I am ready," she said to Bjorn, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. The warrior nodded once, then turned to Jarl Erik. "The matter is concluded, my Jarl. I thank you for your generosity." Erik waved a dismissive hand. "You have earned this and more, Bjorn. Use her as you see fit. If she proves troublesome, you know what to do." His cold eyes found Astrid once more. "And you, girl, would do well to remember your place. Your father's cowardice has determined your fate. Accept it with whatever grace you can muster." The walk from her father's longhouse to Bjorn's dwelling felt like a journey through a dream. Each step weighted with a surreal quality that made Astrid question if this was truly happening. The settlement of Bjornstad was quiet in the gathering dusk, with most families already inside their homes preparing the evening meal. The few people who were still outside stopped to stare as she passed, a young woman walking behind one of the Jarl's most feared warriors, her belongings clutched to her chest. She could see the pity in some eyes, curiosity in others, and in a few, barely concealed satisfaction that Thorvald the coward's daughter was finally getting what they believed she deserved for being the child of such a man. Astrid kept her gaze forward, refusing to acknowledge the stares. She would not give them the pleasure of seeing her shame. Her spine remained straight, her head held high despite the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. She had learned long ago how to hide her true feelings, how to present a mask of calm dignity when inside she was falling apart. It was a skill that all women in her world needed to survive. Bjorn walked ahead of her, his long strides eating up the distance between the two longhouses. He did not look back to see if she was following, seeming to trust that she would not try to run. Where would she go if she did? She had no family who would take her in, no friends who would risk the Jarl's anger by harboring a thrall who had fled her master. The wilderness beyond the settlement was unforgiving, filled with wolves and bears and the ever-present cold that could kill an unprepared traveler in a single night. No, there was nowhere to run. Her fate was sealed the moment her father had agreed to Erik's terms. They arrived at a longhouse that was larger and better maintained than her father's had been. It stood near the center of the settlement, a position that spoke of status and importance. The walls were made of thick timber, carefully fitted together and sealed against the wind, and the roof was covered with turf that would provide excellent insulation during the brutal winter months. Smoke rose from the central hearth, and Astrid could see light flickering through the gaps around the door. Someone was already inside. Bjorn pushed open the heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter. "Come," he said simply, his deep voice neither warm nor cold, merely matter-of-fact. Astrid stepped across the threshold into a space that was vastly different from the poverty-stricken hovel she had just left. The longhouse was well appointed, with proper sleeping benches built along the walls, covered in thick furs and woolen blankets. Weapons hung from the posts, axes, swords, spears, all maintained with obvious care, their blades gleaming in the firelight. Shields decorated the walls, painted with designs in red and black. The floor was covered with fresh rushes mixed with herbs that gave off a pleasant scent when crushed underfoot. This was the home of a successful warrior, a man who had earned wealth through his service to the Jarl. Near the fire, stirring a large iron pot, was a woman of middle years. She was stout and strong-looking, with gray-streaked brown hair bound in a practical braid. Her face was weathered but not unkind, marked with the lines of someone who smiled often despite the hardships of life. She looked up as they entered, her eyes moving from Bjorn to Astrid with open curiosity. "So, This is her, the woman said, setting down her wooden spoon and wiping her hands on her apron. The girl from Thorvald's household. Poor child. I heard what happened. The whole settlement is talking about it. This is Helga, Bjorn said to Astrid, his tone making it clear that he expected her to pay attention. She manages my household and has done so since my wife died 5 years ago. You will help her with the work and learn from her. She will teach you what is expected. Astrid felt her heart sink even further. So he had been married. She wondered what kind of woman his wife had been, and whether she had been happy in this house. She wondered if Bjorn had loved her, and if that love had made him kind, or if her death had hardened him into the stone-faced warrior he appeared to be now. Helga stepped closer, studying Astrid with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She is thin, the older woman observed, though not unkindly. Thorvald has not been feeding her properly, I see. Well, we will remedy that soon enough. A woman needs strength to work, and there is plenty of work to be done. She turned to Bjorn. Where will she sleep? There is space on the western bench, Bjorn replied, moving toward the fire to warm his hands. She can make her bed there. And Helga, see that she has proper clothing. Those garments she wears are hardly fit for the winter that is coming. Of course, Helga agreed, then turned her attention back to Astrid. Come, child. Set down your things and let me look at you properly. Astrid did as she was told, placing her bundle on the bench that Bjorn had indicated. Her hands were trembling now, the shock of everything that had happened finally beginning to break through her carefully maintained composure. She felt Helga's rough but gentle hands on her shoulders, turning her toward the light. You have your mother's look about you, Helga said softly, surprising Astrid. Yes, I remember Sigrid. She was a good woman, kind and skilled at her work. It is a shame what became of your father after she died. Grief can destroy a man as surely as any blade. The mention of her mother brought fresh tears to Astrid's eyes. Sigrid had died of a fever 4 winters ago, and her death had been the beginning of Thorvald's downward spiral into weakness and despair. Before that, he had been merely unremarkable. Not a great warrior or leader, but a decent man who provided for his family. After Sigrid's death, it was as if the part of him that had been strong had died with her. I did not know she was known to you, Astrid managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone knew Sigrid, Helga replied, releasing her and moving back to the pot over the fire. She was respected in this settlement, even if your father was not. You carry her blood, child, and that counts for something, even if you are a thrall now. She ladled stew into wooden bowls, the rich smell of meat and vegetables making Astrid realize how hungry she was. Sit, eat. There will be time enough for work tomorrow. Tonight you need food and rest. Bjorn had seated himself on one of the benches, removing his leather jerkin to reveal a simple wool tunic beneath. Without the bulk of his armor and weapons, he was still an imposing figure, but somehow slightly less intimidating. Astrid found herself studying him covertly as she accepted the bowl of stew from Helga. His face, now that she could see it more clearly in the firelight, was not cruel. It was hard and weathered, yes, marked by the life he had lived, but there was no meanness in it. His eyes, when they happened to glance her way, held an expression she could not quite read, something that might have been discomfort or perhaps uncertainty. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scrape of spoons against bowls. The stew was delicious, far better than anything Astrid had eaten in months, rich with chunks of lamb and root vegetables seasoned with herbs. She tried to eat slowly, to maintain some dignity, but her hunger made it difficult. She had been going to bed with her stomach half empty for so long that this abundance felt almost overwhelming. You will sleep when you have finished eating, Bjorn said eventually, his voice breaking the silence. Tomorrow Helga will show you your duties. You will work hard, but you will be fed and clothed. I am not a cruel master, but I expect obedience and competence. Do you understand? Astrid set down her empty bowl, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since entering his home. I understand, she said, keeping her voice level. I will work as required, but I would ask one thing of you. Bjorn's eyebrows rose slightly, as if surprised that she would dare to make any request. Speak. My father may be a coward, and I may be a thrall now because of his weakness, but I am still a person. I ask that you remember that. The words came out before she could stop them, bold and perhaps foolish, but she could not simply surrender every shred of her dignity. She needed him to see her as something more than just property, even if the law said that was exactly what she was. For a long moment, Bjorn simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Helga had gone very still by the fire, clearly uncertain how the warrior would react to such boldness from a thrall. The silence stretched out, heavy with tension, and Astrid wondered if she had just made a terrible mistake. Then, to her surprise, Bjorn gave a slight nod. "I remember it," he said simply. "I have never forgotten that thralls are people, even if others do. You will be treated fairly in this house, Astrid Thorvaldsdottir, so long as you keep your part of the bargain." The use of her full name, rather than simply calling her thrall or girl, was unexpected and strangely moving. It was a small acknowledgement of her humanity, and in that moment Astrid felt the first tiny spark of something that might have been hope. Perhaps this would not be as terrible as she had feared. Perhaps Bjorn Ironside was not the monster his byname suggested. Helga released a breath she had been holding and moved to prepare the sleeping bench for Astrid. "Come, child," she said gently. "Let me show you where things are kept. You will need blankets, and there are clean linens in the chest by the wall." As Astrid rose to follow Helga, she felt Bjorn's gaze on her back. When she glanced over her shoulder, he was staring into the fire, his strong profile limned in gold by the flames, his expression distant and thoughtful. She wondered what he was thinking, this warrior who had accepted her as payment for a debt, who could have demanded anything of her, but who had instead offered her food and a place to sleep and a promise of fair treatment. The sleeping bench was comfortable, far more so than the thin pallet she had used in her father's house. Helga piled furs and blankets on it until it was a nest of warmth, then showed Astrid where the privy was located, where the water was kept, and where she could store her few possessions. The older woman spoke in a low voice, explaining the routines of the household, when Bjorn rose in the morning, when meals were prepared, what tasks would need to be done each day. "He is a good man," Helga said quietly, when they were far enough from the fire that Bjorn would not overhear. "I know it does not feel that way to you now, but I have served in this household for many years, and I can tell you truly, you could have fared much worse. He does not strike women, he does not force himself on those who do not wish it, and he pays fairly for honest work. His wife Astrid, yes, her name was Astrid too, she was happy here. He loved her deeply, and when she died in childbirth, along with the babe, it nearly destroyed him. He has not looked at another woman since. Not with interest, at least." This information shifted something in Astrid's understanding. So Bjorn was a widower who still mourned his wife, who had not taken another woman to his bed in 5 years, despite being in his prime, and having every right to do so. It painted a picture of a man with depth, with feeling, rather than the brutal warrior she had expected. "Why did he accept me then?" Astrid asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If he has no interest in women, why agree to take me as payment?" Helga's expression grew troubled. "That I cannot say for certain. Perhaps he felt obligated since the Jarl offered. Perhaps he thought to help you in his own way, by taking you into a household where you would be protected and treated well. Bjorn is not a man who speaks of his feelings easily, but he is honorable. Whatever his reasons, you are here now, and you will make the best of it." Astrid nodded slowly, processing this information. She lay down on the sleeping bench, pulling the furs up to her chin, and stared at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. Across the longhouse, she could see Bjorn still sitting by the fire, his shoulders hunched slightly, a cup of ale in his large hands. He looked lonely, she realized with a start. For all his strength and status, he looked like a man who carried a great weight on his shoulders, a burden that had nothing to do with battles or oaths to his Jarl. Sleep was a long time coming. Astrid's mind churned with everything that had happened, with grief for the life she had lost and fear for the uncertain future that stretched before her. But eventually, exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into uneasy dreams, where she walked through fog, searching for something she could not name, while behind her, gray eyes watched from the shadows with an expression that might have been longing. The first light of dawn crept through the gaps in the longhouse walls, pale and cold, announcing the beginning of Astrid's first full day as a thrall in Bjorn Ironside's household. She woke to the sound of movement, the crackle of the fire being rebuilt, and the low murmur of voices. For a moment, still wrapped in the warmth of sleep and soft furs, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back upon her with the weight of a falling tree, and she remembered everything. Her father's betrayal, the cold eyes of Jarl Erik, the journey to this house where she now belonged to another. Astrid pushed back the blankets and sat up, her body stiff from the tension of the previous day. Through the dim morning light, she could see Helga already at work by the fire, preparing porridge in the iron pot. Bjorn stood near the door, strapping on his weapons with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done so countless times. His movements were deliberate and controlled, each buckle fastened, each blade checked with meticulous care. He wore his leather armor today, reinforced with iron rings at the shoulders and chest, and his long sword hung at his hip in a worn scabbard. "You are awake," Helga observed, glancing over at Astrid with a slight smile. "Good. Come, eat quickly. There is much to be done today, and the work will not wait for sluggards." Astrid rose from the sleeping bench, smoothing down her dress with hands that were steadier than they had been the night before. She had slept in her clothes, not knowing what else to do, and now they were wrinkled and uncomfortable. She made her way to the fire, accepting the bowl of porridge that Helga handed her. The older woman had sweetened it with honey and added nuts, making it far more palatable than the thin gruel Astrid had grown accustomed to in her father's house. Bjorn finished his preparations and turned to face them. In the growing light, Astrid could see his features more clearly than she had been able to the previous evening. His face was strong and angular, with a broad forehead and a straight nose that looked as though it had been broken at least once and healed slightly crooked. His jaw was square and firm beneath his braided beard, and his gray eyes held an intensity that was almost unsettling. But there was no cruelty in those eyes, she noted again. Only a kind of watchful reserve, as if he were constantly assessing threats and calculating responses. "I'm going to the training grounds," he announced, his deep voice filling the space. "The Jarl wants his warriors in top form. There are rumors of raids from the southern settlements, and we must be prepared. I will return at midday for the meal." His gaze shifted to Astrid, lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Helga will teach you what needs to be done. Work hard, and there will be no problems." "Yes, master," Astrid said quietly, the words tasting bitter on her tongue, but necessary nonetheless. She was a thrall now, and she would have to use such forms of address whether she liked it or not. Something flickered across Bjorn's face at the word master, an expression that might have been discomfort, or perhaps regret, but it passed so quickly that Astrid could not be certain she had seen it at all. He gave a curt nod, then pushed open the door and strode out into the cold morning air, his broad shoulders disappearing into the mist that rose from the fjord. Once he was gone, Helga released a long breath and turned to Astrid with a more relaxed expression. "Well then, let us begin. First, you must understand the routine of this household. Bjorn is a man of order and discipline. He expects his home to be well maintained, his meals prepared on time, and his belongings cared for properly. He is not difficult to please, but he notices when things are not as they should be." Over the next several hours, Helga showed Astrid the full scope of her new responsibilities. There was water to be fetched from the well, carried in heavy wooden buckets that made Astrid's arms ache. There were clothes to be washed in the cold stream that ran behind the settlement, pounded against rocks until the dirt came loose and then hung to dry on lines stretched between posts. There was wool to be carded and spun, thread to be woven into cloth on the large loom that dominated one corner of the longhouse. There were floors to be swept, furs to be shaken out and aired, weapons to be oiled and polished, and 1,000 other small tasks that kept a household running. Astrid threw herself into the work with a determination born of desperation. If she was going to be a thrall, if this was the life that had been forced upon her, then she would at least be a competent one. She would not give Bjorn any reason to regret taking her in, would not give him cause to punish her or sell her to someone worse. The work was hard, and her hands were unused to some of it, but she had been raised by a mother who believed that all women should know how to manage a household, and the skills came back to her quickly. As she worked, Helga talked. The older woman seemed to have a story for everything, a piece of advice for every task, and a gentle patience that made the learning easier. She told Astrid about the settlement, about the various families and their histories, about the politics that swirled beneath the surface of daily life. She spoke of Jarl Erik and his ambitions to expand his territory, of the rivalries between different warriors in his herd, of the trading ships that came and went with the seasons, and she spoke of Bjorn. Slowly, carefully, as if testing how much Astrid could be trusted with such information, Helga revealed the story of the man who now owned her. Bjorn had come to Bjornstad as a young man of 15, she explained, already tall and strong but still untested in battle. He had been orphaned when raiders burned his family's farm further north, killing his parents and siblings while he was out hunting. He had arrived at the settlement with nothing but his father's sword and a burning desire to become strong enough that he would never be helpless again. Jarl Erik, recognizing the boy's potential, had taken him into his herd and trained him personally. Bjorn had proven to be a natural warrior, fierce in battle but disciplined and strategic rather than reckless. He had earned his byname Ironside, not because he was invulnerable, but because his enemies said that fighting him was like striking iron. He never yielded, never broke, never gave ground unless he chose to. Over the years, he had become Erik's most trusted fighter, the man the Jarl sent when the task was most dangerous or most important. He married young, Helga continued, her hands busy carding wool as she spoke, to Astrid Harald's daughter, the daughter of a shipbuilder. She was lovely, spirited, full of life and laughter. They were happy together, as happy as any couple I have seen. He was gentle with her, attentive and caring in ways that surprised those who knew only his reputation as a warrior. When she became pregnant, he was overjoyed. He planned for the child, built a new cradle with his own hands, spoke of teaching a son to fight or a daughter to be strong. Helga paused in her work, her expression growing somber. But the birth went badly. The child was turned wrong, and no amount of skill from the midwife could save either of them. Astrid bled to death in Bjorn's arms, and the babe, a son, never drew breath. I think something in Bjorn died that day as well. He has not been the same since. He still fights, still serves the Jarl with complete loyalty, but the light has gone out of him. He goes through life like a man walking through fog, doing what needs to be done, but finding no joy in it. The story moved Astrid deeply, stirring feelings of sympathy she had not expected to have for her new master. She thought of how he had looked the previous night, staring into the fire with that expression of profound loneliness. And now she understood it better. He was a man who had lost everything that mattered to him, who had built walls around his heart to protect himself from ever being hurt so deeply again. Why did he never remarry? Astrid asked softly, setting aside the wool she had been carding. Surely there were women who would have been willing. A man of his status and strength. Many were willing, Helga confirmed. But he wanted none of them. He said once, after too much ale, that he had loved once and that was enough for one lifetime. He would not dishonor Astrid's memory by replacing her with someone he could not love, and so he has remained alone, devoted to his duty and nothing else. They worked in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Astrid found herself wondering what it would be like to be loved with such fierce devotion, to be mourned so deeply that even years after death, the person left behind could not move on. Her own mother and father had cared for each other, certainly, but their love had been more practical than passionate, based on mutual respect and shared labor rather than deep emotional connection. What Bjorn had felt for his wife must have been something extraordinary. The morning wore on, and Astrid discovered that despite the hard work and her new status as a thrall, she felt more at peace than she had in months. In her father's household, there had been a constant undercurrent of tension and shame, a weight of disappointment that had pressed down on everything. Here, the atmosphere was different. The work was demanding, but it was honest work, done in a home that was well-ordered and functional. Helga was kind and patient, teaching rather than criticizing, encouraging rather than berating. And though Bjorn was her master and she his property, he had shown her more dignity in their brief interactions than her own father had in the final years of their relationship. Midday approached, and Helga began preparing the meal. She set Astrid to cutting vegetables while she herself prepared the meat, a haunch of venison that Bjorn had brought home from a recent hunt. The longhouse filled with the rich smells of cooking, and Astrid's stomach rumbled despite the generous breakfast she had eaten that morning. The door opened and Bjorn entered, bringing with him the scent of cold air and male sweat. He was breathing hard, his face flushed from exertion, and Astrid could see that his tunic was damp despite the chill of the day. He had clearly been training intensely. He removed his sword belt and hung it on its peg, then stripped off his leather armor and outer tunic, leaving only his woolen undershirt. The fabric clung to his frame, outlining muscles that looked carved from stone, and Astrid found herself staring, before she caught herself, and quickly looked away, her cheeks warming. "The meal smells good," Bjorn commented, moving to the basin of water kept near the door to wash his hands and face. The water in the basin had been cold when Astrid filled it that morning, and she saw him wince slightly as he splashed it on his heated skin, but he made no complaint. "It will be ready shortly," Helga assured him. "Astrid has been a great help today. She is a quick learner and a hard worker." Bjorn glanced at Astrid, his gray eyes assessing. "Good," he said simply. "I am glad to hear it." He dried his hands on a cloth and moved to sit at the table, a massive piece of oak that could seat 8 men comfortably. "How are you finding the work?" he asked Astrid directly, surprising her with the question. "It is demanding but fair," Astrid replied carefully, setting down the knife she had been using. "Helga is an excellent teacher, and I am grateful for her patience." "You need not be so formal," Bjorn said, a hint of something that might have been amusement touching his stern features. "We are not in the Jarl's hall. In this house you may speak plainly." He paused, seeming to consider his words. "I know this situation is not of your choosing. I know you would rather be anywhere else than here. But you are here, and we must make the best of it. If you work well and cause no trouble, I will treat you fairly. That is my word." The words hung in the air between them, and Astrid felt something shift in her chest. Bjorn's promise was more than she had expected, more than many thralls ever received from their masters. She met his gaze directly, seeing in those gray eyes a sincerity that could not be faked. He meant what he said, and somehow that made everything slightly more bearable. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I will do my best to fulfill my duties and earn that fair treatment." They ate the midday meal together, the 3 of them seated at the great oak table. The venison was tender and flavorful, seasoned with herbs that Helga had dried from her garden the previous summer. There was fresh bread as well, dark and dense with a crust that crackled when broken, and butter churned just that morning. It was a feast compared to what Astrid had been eating for the past year, and she found herself savoring every bite. Bjorn ate with the focused efficiency of a warrior, consuming large portions without seeming to taste them particularly. It was fuel for his body, nothing more. But when Helga offered him a second helping of the venison, he accepted with a nod of appreciation, and Astrid noticed the small smile that touched the older woman's face. She took pride in her cooking, that much was clear, and Bjorn's appetite was a compliment. "There was news at the training grounds this morning," Bjorn said between bites, addressing Helga but speaking loudly enough that Astrid could hear as well. "The Jarl received word from his scouts. The southern settlement of Ravensfjord is planning something. They have been gathering warriors and supplies, more than would be needed for ordinary raids. Eric believes they may be planning an attack on Bjornstad itself." Helga's expression grew troubled. "War, then? How long do we have to prepare?" "Unknown. Could be weeks, could be months. Eric is sending envoys to our allied settlements, calling for support. If Ravensfjord does attack, they will find us ready." Bjorn's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than the possibility of battle and death. But Astrid could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand unconsciously moved toward where his sword would normally hang at his hip. "Will you lead the defense?" Helga asked, though the answer seemed obvious. "The Jarl has not said, but likely yes. He trusts few others to hold the line when the fighting gets desperate." Bjorn finished his meal and pushed back from the table, rising to his full impressive height. "I must return to the training grounds. The men need to drill more on shield wall formations. If we are to face Ravensfjord, we cannot afford any weakness." After he left, Astrid helped Helga clear the table and wash the dishes in a wooden tub filled with water heated over the fire. Her hands moved automatically through the familiar motions while her mind churned with what she had just heard. War. The word carried such weight, such terrible implications. She had lived through raids before, had hidden in the root cellar while warriors fought and killed above her head. But an actual war between settlements was something different entirely. It would be brutal and bloody, and many would die. "You are worried," Helga observed, glancing at Astrid's troubled face. "Should I not be? If there is war, what happens to us? To the women and children? We survive," Helga said firmly. "As we always have. The warriors will fight, and we will do what needs to be done to support them and protect the settlement. You are young, Astrid, but you will learn quickly that life in these lands requires strength from everyone, not just the men who carry swords." The afternoon brought more work. Helga sent Astrid to the market square to purchase supplies: salt for preserving meat, extra wool for spinning, iron nails that Bjorn had requested for repairs to the longhouse. She gave Astrid a leather pouch containing hacked silver, pieces of jewelry and coins that had been cut apart to make specific weights for trade. It was a measure of trust, Astrid realized. Helga was trusting her not to run away with the silver, not to try to buy her freedom or escape. The older woman seemed to understand that Astrid had nowhere to go, no life to return to, and that the best she could hope for was to make a place for herself here. The market square was bustling with activity despite the cold wind that swept down from the mountains. Merchants had set up stalls selling everything from fish and game to tools and weapons. Women haggled over prices, their voices sharp and persistent, while children ran between the stalls playing games and getting underfoot. Astrid moved through the crowd with her head down, acutely aware of her changed status. She was no longer the daughter of a freeman, however disgraced. She was a thrall, property, and people would treat her accordingly. She was examining a bundle of wool at one stall when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Well, if it isn't the coward's daughter, now reduced to running errands for her master. Astrid's blood ran cold. She turned slowly to find Ingrid Eriksdottir standing behind her, arms crossed over her chest and a smirk on her beautiful face. Ingrid was the Jarl's youngest daughter, a woman of 22 winters who was known throughout the settlement for her beauty and her cruelty in equal measure. She had always looked down on Astrid, even before Thorvald's disgrace, and now that Astrid was a thrall, there would be no limits to her contempt. "Lady Ingrid," Astrid said carefully, keeping her voice neutral and her eyes lowered in the appropriate gesture of respect. "I am simply purchasing supplies for Bjorn Ironside's household." "Bjorn Ironside," Ingrid repeated, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Yes, I heard he took you as payment for your father's debts. How generous of him, really. Most men would not want the daughter of such a coward in their home, even as a thrall. But then, Bjorn has always had a soft heart, hasn't he? Too soft, some would say. It makes him weak." Astrid bit back the angry response that rose to her lips. Bjorn was many things, but weak was not among them. She had seen the respect in other warriors' eyes when they looked at him, had heard the stories of his prowess in battle. But arguing with the Jarl's daughter would only bring trouble down on her head, and possibly on Bjorn's household as well. "I must complete my errands, my lady," Astrid said quietly, turning back to the wool merchant. "By your leave." But Ingrid was not finished. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that only Astrid could hear. "You may think you have found a safe place with Bjorn, but do not get comfortable. My father has plans, and Bjorn will play his part, whether he wishes to or not. And you, thrall, are nothing but a piece in a larger game. Remember your place, or you will find yourself in circumstances far worse than you can imagine." Before Astrid could respond, Ingrid swept away in a swirl of fine wool cloak, leaving Astrid shaken and confused. What had she meant by that? What plans did the Jarl have that involved Bjorn? And why had she bothered to threaten a mere thrall? Astrid completed her purchases in a daze, her mind turning over Ingrid's words again and again, trying to find meaning in them. When she returned to the longhouse, her arms laden with supplies, she found Helga preparing the evening meal. The older woman took one look at Astrid's troubled face and frowned. "What happened?" she asked bluntly. Astrid hesitated, then told her about the encounter with Ingrid. Helga's expression grew grave as she listened, her hands stilling in their work. "That girl is poison," Helga muttered when Astrid had finished. "She has always had her eye on Bjorn, ever since she was old enough to notice men. She wants him for herself, wants to be the wife of the Jarl's greatest warrior. But Bjorn has never shown her the slightest interest, and it galls her pride." "What did she mean about the Jarl having plans?" Astrid asked. Helga was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to say. Finally she sighed and set down the knife she had been holding. "Eric has been trying to convince Bjorn to marry Ingrid for over a year now. He wants to bind his best warrior to him through family ties, to ensure Bjorn's loyalty beyond simple oaths. But Bjorn has refused every time. He says he will not marry again, and certainly not for political gain. It has become a source of tension between them." Astrid felt her stomach clench with an emotion she could not quite name. The thought of Bjorn married to Ingrid, of that cruel woman ruling this household, filled her with something that felt suspiciously like dread. But why should she care? Bjorn was her master, nothing more. His marriage prospects were none of her concern.
"The Jarl is not a man who accepts refusal easily," Helga continued. "He will find a way to get what he wants, one way or another. And I fear that your arrival here may have complicated matters in ways we do not yet understand." Before Astrid could ask what she meant by that, the door burst open and Bjorn strode in, his face dark with anger. He moved to the weapons rack and began checking his sword, his movements sharp and aggressive.
Something had happened at the training grounds, something that had disturbed his usual stoic calm. "Bjorn?" Helga ventured carefully. "What troubles you?" "The Jarl," Bjorn said tersely. His jaw clenched so tight that Astrid could see the muscle jumping beneath his beard. "He summoned me after training. He wants me to reconsider his offer regarding his daughter. He says that war is coming and that strong alliances within the settlement will be crucial. He implied that my refusal is beginning to look like disloyalty." "That is absurd," Helga said hotly. "You are the most loyal warrior he has. Everyone knows this. Everyone knows I will not marry where there is no respect or affection." Bjorn countered, his voice rising slightly before he visibly controlled himself. "I told Eric again that I will not marry Ingrid. I serve him faithfully in all things, but my choice of wife, if I ever choose to take one, is my own concern." "How did he respond?" Helga asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer would not be good. Bjorn's laugh was bitter and without humor. "He reminded me that thralls can be taken away as easily as they are given. He said that if I valued the well-being of my household, I would think carefully about continuing to disappoint him." The threat was clear, and Astrid felt ice form in her veins. The Jarl was using her as leverage against Bjorn, threatening to remove her from the household, or worse, if Bjorn did not comply with his wishes. She was a pawn in a game she barely understood, and the realization made her feel sick and helpless. Bjorn's eyes found hers across the room, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. It was not anger directed at her, but rather a fierce protectiveness that she had not expected. In that moment she realized that despite knowing her for barely 2 days, Bjorn considered her part of his household, under his protection, and the Jarl's threat against her had touched something deep within his warrior's code of honor. "No one will take you from this house," Bjorn said directly to Astrid, his voice low and intense. "I gave you my word that you would be treated fairly here, and I will not break that word because Eric wishes to manipulate me. You are under my protection now, and that means something." "But the Jarl," Astrid began, her voice trembling. "The Jarl forgets that loyalty is earned, not commanded," Bjorn interrupted. "I have bled for him, killed for him, risked my life in his service more times than I can count. If he thinks he can force me into an unwanted marriage by threatening a thrall who has done nothing wrong, then he understands me far less than I thought." The conviction in his voice was absolute, and Astrid found herself believing him. Whatever else Bjorn Ironside might be, he was a man of his word, a man who valued honor above political convenience. But she also knew enough about the world to understand that such principles could be dangerous when faced with the will of a powerful Jarl. The days that followed were tense, with an undercurrent of anxiety that permeated the entire settlement. Word had spread quickly about the Jarl's displeasure with Bjorn, and people whispered in corners about what might happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. Astrid went about her duties with renewed diligence, as if by being the perfect thrall she could somehow make the situation better, though she knew in her heart that this conflict had nothing to do with her competence and everything to do with power and pride. She had been in Bjorn's household for nearly 2 weeks when the first snow fell, transforming the landscape into a world of white and gray. The fjord took on a leaden quality, its waters dark and forbidding beneath the pale sky, and the mountains that ringed the settlement became ghostly shapes in the distance. The cold deepened, settling into bones and making every breath visible in the air. It was the kind of cold that killed the unprepared, that made survival a daily challenge, requiring constant vigilance and hard work. Astrid found herself spending more time with Bjorn than she had expected. The weather made outdoor training difficult, so he often worked on maintaining his weapons and equipment inside the longhouse, sitting by the fire with his sword across his knees, carefully oiling the blade and checking the edge. She would work at the loom or spin wool while he worked, and gradually they began to talk. At first, the conversations were simple and practical, discussions about household needs, questions about supplies, comments about the weather and the coming winter. But slowly, Almost imperceptibly, they evolved into something more. Bjorn began to ask her about her life before she came to his house, and Astrid found herself telling him stories about her mother, about the skills Sigrid had taught her, about the days before her father's fear had consumed him and destroyed their family's standing. "Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman," Bjorn said one evening, his deep voice thoughtful as he set aside the shield he had been repairing. "Helga has spoken of her as well. It is clear she left a strong impression on those who knew her." "She was the strongest person I have ever known," Astrid replied, her fingers pausing in their spinning. "Not in the way warriors are strong, but in a different way. She faced every hardship with grace and dignity. When the crops failed or the winter was harsh, she never complained. She simply did what needed to be done. I wish I had more of her strength." "You have more than you realize," Bjorn said, and when Astrid looked up in surprise, she found him watching her with an expression that was almost gentle. "You have faced your circumstances with courage. You could have been bitter and difficult, making everyone around you miserable. Instead, you have worked hard and adapted. That takes a different kind of strength, but it is strength nonetheless." The praise warmed something inside Astrid that had been cold for a very long time. It had been so long since anyone had said anything kind to her, had acknowledged her efforts, or seen her as anything other than an extension of her father's shame. She felt tears prick at her eyes and quickly looked down at her spinning, not wanting Bjorn to see how much his words had affected her. But Bjorn had seen, and after a moment of silence he spoke again, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I know what it is to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. When my family died, I came here with nothing but my father's sword and a heart full of rage. I was ready to throw my life away in battle, caring nothing for survival, only for vengeance against a world that had taken everything from me. But Eric saw something in me, some potential I could not see in myself. He gave me purpose, taught me discipline, helped me channel my anger into something useful. Without that, I would have died young and foolish, accomplishing nothing." It was the most Bjorn had ever spoken about himself at one time, and Astrid listened intently, hungry for this glimpse into the man behind the warrior's facade. She could picture him as he must have been, a tall, angry boy with nothing to lose, fighting with the desperation of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. "And then you found love," Astrid said softly, remembering what Helga had told her about his wife. "Helga said you were happy with Astrid." Bjorn's expression shifted, becoming distant and pained. For a moment, Astrid feared she had overstepped, had touched on something too private and raw, but then he nodded slowly, his gray eyes fixed on the fire. "I was happy," he confirmed quietly. "For the first time since my family died, I felt like I had a home again, a future worth living for. Astrid brought light into my life when I had thought there would only be darkness. She laughed easily, found joy in simple things, and somehow she saw past the grim warrior everyone else saw, and found something worth loving." He paused, his jaw tightening. "When I lost her, when I held her as the life drained from her body and there was nothing I could do to save her, I swore I would never allow myself to care that deeply again. The pain of losing her was worse than any wound I have ever taken in battle. It nearly destroyed me. But you survived," Astrid said gently. "You continued on." "I survived," Bjorn agreed, though his tone suggested he was not entirely certain that was a good thing. "But surviving is not the same as living. I go through the motions, do my duty, fight when called upon. But the joy is gone. It has been gone for 5 years, and I do not know if it will ever return." Astrid's heart ached for him. She understood loss, understood grief, but what Bjorn described went beyond simple mourning. He had loved so completely that losing that love had fundamentally changed who he was, had left him hollowed out and going through life like a man walking through a dream. It explained so much about him: his emotional distance, his dedication to duty over personal happiness, his refusal to remarry despite pressure from the Jarl. "Perhaps joy returns when we least expect it," she offered, not knowing what else to say. "Perhaps it sneaks up on us when we have stopped looking for it." Bjorn turned to look at her fully, and there was something in his gaze that made Astrid's breath catch. It was not desire exactly, but rather a kind of wondering recognition, as if he was seeing her truly for the first time and finding something unexpected. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts and feelings that neither was quite ready to name. The spell was broken by the sound of heavy fists pounding on the door. Bjorn was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his sword, even as he called out, "Who comes?" "Jarl Eric's messenger," came the reply from outside. "I bear words for Bjorn Ironside, and they are urgent." Bjorn exchanged a glance with Helga, who had been working in the corner and had gone very still. He moved to the door and opened it, revealing a young warrior with snowflakes melting in his beard and an expression of barely controlled excitement on his face. "The Jarl summons you to the Great Hall immediately," the messenger announced. "The scouts have returned from Ravensfjord. War is confirmed. They will attack with the next full moon, which is but 10 days hence. All warriors are called to council." "I will come at once," Bjorn said, already reaching for his cloak and weapons. He turned back to Astrid and Helga. "Bar the door after I leave and do not open it for anyone but me. These are dangerous times, and I will not have my household vulnerable while I am away." Astrid felt fear clutch at her chest. 10 days until war. 10 days until Bjorn would be fighting for his life against warriors who wanted to burn Bjornstad to the ground and claim its wealth for themselves. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the safety and stability his protection provided, and the thought of losing that, of losing him, filled her with a dread that went beyond simple concern for her own welfare. "Be careful," she said impulsively, the words escaping before she could think better of them. "Please." Bjorn paused in the doorway, turning back to look at her with an expression of surprise that quickly softened into something warmer. "I will," he promised. "I have no intention of dying in this fight. I have responsibilities here that I mean to honor." His eyes held hers for a long moment, and Astrid felt something pass between them, some wordless understanding that things had shifted between them in ways neither had anticipated. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him and leaving Astrid and Helga alone in the longhouse with only the crackling fire and their racing thoughts for company. "He cares for you," Helga said quietly, once the sound of Bjorn's footsteps had faded. "I have seen it growing these past weeks, though I do not think he has admitted it to himself yet." "He is my master," Astrid protested, though even as she said it, she knew the words rang hollow. "I am his thrall. Whatever he feels, it can only be the concern a man has for his property." "You know that is not true," Helga said gently but firmly. "I have been in this household for 5 years, Astrid. I saw how Bjorn was after his wife died, how he closed himself off from all feeling, all connection. He has been like a man made of stone, going through life without truly living it. But since you came here, I have seen cracks in that stone. I have seen him smile, heard him laugh, rare though it is. I have watched him watching you when you do not notice, and I recognize the look in his eyes. It is the same look he had when he courted Astrid Harald's daughter all those years ago, though he fights against it with everything he has." Astrid's heart was pounding now, her mind racing with the implications of Helga's words. She could not deny that her own feelings toward Bjorn had changed dramatically over the past 2 weeks. What had started as fear and resentment had gradually transformed into something else. Respect first, then admiration, and now something warmer and more dangerous that she was afraid to examine too closely. He was handsome, certainly, with his powerful frame and intense eyes, but it was more than that. It was his unexpected kindness, his honor, the glimpses of vulnerability beneath his warrior's exterior that had captured her attention, and, she was beginning to fear, her heart. But what future could there be for such feelings? She was a thrall, he was a free man, and a renowned warrior. Even if he did care for her in some way beyond the duty of a master toward his property, the social divide between them was enormous. And beyond that loomed the larger problem of Jarl Erik and his daughter Ingrid, who would stop at nothing to make Bjorn marry into the Jarl's family. "What should I do?" Astrid asked, feeling lost and confused. "Even if what you say is true, even if he does care for me, there is no path forward for us. The law, society, the Jarl, everything stands between us." "I do not have answers for you, child," Helga admitted, coming to sit beside Astrid and taking her hand in a motherly gesture. "I only know that matters of the heart are complicated and rarely follow the paths we expect them to. What I can tell you is this: Bjorn Ironside is a man of honor. If he has feelings for you, he will struggle against them because he will see them as inappropriate, as taking advantage of his position of power over you. But he is also a man who, when he finally allows himself to love, loves with his entire being. If you can reach his heart, truly reach it, He will move mountains to protect you and keep you by his side. The hours stretched on interminably as Astrid and Helga waited for Bjorn to return from the war council. They kept busy with work, but Astrid's hands moved mechanically, while her mind remained fixed on the great hall, wondering what was being discussed, what plans were being made. Would Bjorn be asked to lead the defense? Would he be placed in the most dangerous position, as the Jarl's best warrior inevitably would be? And would he survive the coming battle? It was well past midnight when Bjorn finally returned, his face grim and his shoulders tight with tension. Snow covered his cloak and had frozen in his beard, making him look like some ancient frost giant from the old stories. He stamped his feet to dislodge the snow and removed his outer garments, accepting the cup of hot ale that Helga pressed into his hands with a grateful nod. "The news is worse than we thought," Bjorn said heavily, settling onto the bench near the fire and staring into the flames as if seeking answers there. "Ravensfjord has allied with 2 other settlements. They will come at us with more than 300 warriors, nearly twice our number. Eric has sent urgent messages to our allies, but even if they come in time, we will be hard-pressed to hold them off." Helga drew in a sharp breath, her hand going to her throat. 300 warriors. Odin, protect us. Eric wants me to command the shield wall at the main gate. Bjorn continued, his voice flat and emotionless in the way of warriors discussing their probable deaths. "It is the most vulnerable point in our defenses, and the place where the fighting will be fiercest. He said there is no one else he trusts to hold that position, that if the gate falls, the settlement falls with it. You will hold it," Helga said with fierce conviction. "You have never failed in battle, Bjorn Ironside. You will not fail now. I will do my duty." Bjorn agreed, but Astrid could hear the weariness beneath his words. He was not afraid of the fighting itself, that much was clear from his calm demeanor, but rather exhausted by the weight of responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. So many lives would depend on his strength and skill in the coming battle. If he fell, if the gate was breached, women and children would be slaughtered, homes would be burned, and everything the people of Bjornstad had built would be destroyed. Astrid found herself moving without conscious thought, going to the kitchen area and preparing a bowl of stew that had been kept warm over the fire. She brought it to Bjorn, along with fresh bread and more ale, setting them before him on the table. "You need to eat," she said softly, her voice carrying more concern than she had intended to reveal. "You cannot fight if you have no strength." Bjorn looked up at her, and something in his expression shifted. The warrior's mask slipped slightly, and for just a moment she saw the man beneath, tired, burdened, but touched by her concern. He reached out and briefly, so briefly it might have been her imagination, his fingers brushed against hers where they rested on the table. "Thank you," he said, and the simple words carried far more weight than they should have. He began to eat, and Astrid retreated to give him space, but she could feel his gaze following her as she moved about the longhouse, tidying things that did not need tidying just to have something to do with her nervous hands. "There is more," Bjorn said after he had eaten half the stew. "Eric made another attempt to convince me to marry Ingrid. He said that if I would agree, he would give me command of all his warriors, make me his second in all things. He promised land, wealth, status, beyond anything I currently have. And he said that after the battle, if we survive, my refusal to marry his daughter will be seen as betrayal, and he will have no choice but to act accordingly. He threatens you openly now," Helga said, her voice sharp with anger. "After all you have done for him, after all the blood you have spilled in his service." "He is desperate," Bjorn replied. "The coming war has made him realize how fragile his power truly is. He needs strong alliances, needs to bind his best warriors to him through ties of blood and marriage. I understand his reasoning, even if I cannot accept his methods." "What did you tell him?" Astrid asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was terrified of the answer, terrified that Bjorn might have agreed to save himself and his household from the Jarl's wrath. Bjorn's eyes found hers across the room, and she saw steel in them, the unbreakable will that had earned him his by-name. "I told him the same thing I have told him every time he has asked. I will not marry without love or at least deep respect. I will not tie myself to a woman I cannot honor, and I certainly cannot honor Ingrid, Eric's daughter, who has shown herself to be cruel and manipulative. If he chooses to see that as betrayal after the battle, then so be it. I will face the consequences of my choices." Relief flooded through Astrid so powerfully that her knees felt weak. She had not realized until that moment how much she had feared that Bjorn would give in to the pressure, would sacrifice his principles for safety and advancement. But he had not. He had stood firm, even knowing what it might cost him. "You are a fool," Helga said, but her tone was affectionate rather than critical. "An honorable fool, but a fool nonetheless. Erik could make your life very difficult after this war is over." "If I survive the war, I will deal with Erik's displeasure," Bjorn said with a slight shrug. "But I will not compromise who I am, not even for a jarl. My honor is all I truly own in this life. Without it, I am nothing." He finished his meal and stood, stretching his massive frame with a wince that suggested old injuries bothering him in the cold. "I must rest. Tomorrow the real preparations begin, and there will be little sleep in the days ahead. We will train from dawn until dusk, prepare the defenses, ready ourselves for what is coming." Astrid and Helga prepared their own sleeping areas, and soon the longhouse grew quiet, except for the crackling of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. But Astrid could not sleep. She lay on her bench, wrapped in furs, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, and thinking about everything that had been said that evening. In 10 days, Bjorn would face death at the gate of Bjornstad. In 10 days, she might lose this man who had shown her more kindness and respect in 2 weeks than her own father had shown her in years. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She cared for him, not as a thrall for her master, not out of simple gratitude for fair treatment, but as a woman for a man. She cared what happened to him. She wanted him to survive, wanted to see him smile more often, wanted to ease the loneliness she saw in his eyes. When had this happened? When had her feelings transformed from resentment and fear into something so much more dangerous? Unable to bear the turmoil of her thoughts any longer, Astrid rose quietly from her bench and moved to sit by the dying fire, pulling a blanket around her shoulders against the chill. She sat there in the darkness, watching the embers glow and trying to make sense of the confusion in her heart. "You cannot sleep either," came Bjorn's deep voice from the shadows, making her start. He emerged from his sleeping area, wrapped in a fur cloak, and came to sit near the fire with her. Too many thoughts, too many worries. "Yes," Astrid admitted quietly. "I keep thinking about the coming battle, about what might happen. I know it is not my place to worry about such things, but I cannot help it. It is natural to fear war," Bjorn said, stirring the fire with an iron poker and adding a fresh log that sent sparks spiraling upward. "Only fools feel no fear before battle. The brave are simply those who act despite their fear." They sat in silence for a moment, the new log catching and beginning to burn with a warm golden light that pushed back the darkness. Finally, Astrid gathered her courage and spoke the words that had been burning in her heart. "I do not want you to die," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I know that is selfish of me, that many will die in this war, and my concern should not be for one man alone. But I cannot help it. The thought of you falling in battle, of this house without you in it, fills me with such dread that I can barely breathe." Bjorn turned to look at her fully, his gray eyes intense in the firelight. For a long moment he simply studied her face, as if memorizing every detail, and Astrid felt heat rise to her cheeks under his scrutiny. "Why?" he asked finally, his voice rough with some emotion she could not identify. "Why does it matter to you whether I live or die?" "You are here against your will, bound to my service through no choice of your own. By all rights, you should hope I fall in battle so that you might have a chance at freedom. Because you have treated me with kindness when you did not have to," Astrid replied, meeting his gaze without flinching despite her racing heart. "Because you have shown me respect and dignity when the world says I deserve neither. Because in these few weeks, you have given me something I had lost. Hope. Hope that there is still goodness in this world, still honor and decency. If you die, that hope dies with you." The words hung between them, honest and raw, and Astrid saw something shift in Bjorn's expression. The walls he had built around his heart, the defenses that had protected him from feeling anything for 5 long years, were cracking. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the war between his desire to remain safely numb and the pull of genuine emotion awakening after so long dormant. "Astrid," he said, and his voice was almost anguished. "You do not understand what you are saying. You are young, you have been through trauma, Your judgment is clouded by gratitude and circumstance. What you think you feel. Do not tell me what I think or feel, Astrid interrupted, surprised by her own boldness. I am not a child, Bjorn. I am a woman grown, and I know my own heart. I understand the impossibility of this situation. I understand all the reasons why nothing can come of these feelings. But that does not make them any less real. Bjorn stood abruptly, pacing away from the fire like a caged wolf. When he turned back to her, his face was tormented with conflicting emotions. You are my thrall. I have power over you. Any feelings you have could be influenced by that power, by fear, or by the need to please me to ensure your own safety. I will not take advantage of such a situation. Is that truly what you believe? Astrid asked, rising to face him. That I speak these words out of fear or calculation? Look at me, Bjorn. Look into my eyes and tell me that what you see there is anything other than genuine feeling. He did look, and what he saw there must have shaken him to his core, because his stern expression crumbled. Even if your feelings are genuine, he said quietly, even if they are not born of fear or manipulation, what future could there be for us? I am a warrior who may die in 10 days. You are a thrall with no freedom, no rights. The Jarl seeks to control me through marriage to his daughter, and if I refuse after the battle, he will make all our lives difficult. How can I ask you to care for a man whose future is so uncertain? You did not ask, Astrid pointed out gently. The heart does not wait for permission or perfect circumstances. It simply feels what it feels. She took a step closer to him, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. I know this is complicated. I know there are 100 reasons why this should not be. But I also know that in a world where death can come at any moment, where war and hardship are constants, moments of genuine connection are precious beyond measure. Can you honestly say you feel nothing for me? The question hung in the air between them, challenging him to be as honest as she had been. Astrid could see the struggle on his face, could see him fighting against years of carefully maintained emotional distance. Finally, he reached out with one large hand and gently touched her face, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. No, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I cannot say that. From the moment I saw you standing in your father's house, trying so hard to be brave despite your fear, something in me responded. I told myself it was merely pity, or perhaps admiration for your dignity in difficult circumstances. But as the days passed and I came to know you, I realized it was more than that. You remind me that there is still beauty in this world, still gentleness and grace. You make me want to be more than just a weapon for the Jarl to wield. You make me want to live again, not just survive. Tears spilled down Astrid's cheeks at his words, but they were tears of joy mixed with sorrow for all the pain both of them had endured to reach this moment. Bjorn gently wiped them away with his thumb, his touch reverent, as if she were something precious and fragile that might shatter if handled roughly. But what can we do? Astrid asked, her voice breaking. Even if we both feel this way, the world will not simply allow us to be together. You are bound by duty to the Jarl. I am bound by law as your thrall. And war comes that may take you from me before we have a chance to explore what this could be. Then we face it as we must, Bjorn said firmly, his warrior's resolve returning now that he had acknowledged the truth of his feelings. I will fight in this war with everything I have, and I will survive it. I have survived every battle I have fought for 25 years, and I will survive this one too. And when the battle is done, when Ravensfjord has been defeated, I will find a way to make things right between us. How? Astrid pressed, needing to understand how he could possibly overcome all the obstacles that stood in their path. The Jarl will demand you marry his daughter. If you refuse, he will punish you, perhaps even take me away as he threatened. And even if he does not, I am still your thrall. Society will never accept a relationship between us as anything legitimate. Bjorn's jaw set with determination, and Astrid recognized the expression from the stories she had heard about him in battle. It was the look of a man who had decided on a course of action and would not be swayed from it regardless of the cost. After the battle, I will go to Eric and tell him plainly that I will never marry Ingrid, that my loyalty to him as Jarl remains unshaken, but that my personal life is my own to govern. If he cannot accept that, if he chooses to see it as betrayal, then I will take my chances and leave Bjornstad. I have skills that any Jarl would value, and there are other settlements that would welcome a warrior of my reputation." He cupped Astrid's face in both hands now, his gray eyes blazing with intensity. "As for your status as a thrall, that is easily remedied. I will free you, give you back your independence and your rights. Once you are free, what grows between us will be a choice you make, not something forced upon you by circumstance or law." "You would leave everything you have built here?" Astrid asked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was proposing. "Your home, your position, your years of service to Eric? You would give all that up?" "I would give up far more than that," Bjorn said simply. "I have lived for 5 years in a kind of death, going through the motions of life without truly feeling anything. You have awakened something in me that I thought was lost forever. I will not let that go, not for Eric, not for status or wealth or comfort. If I must start over elsewhere to build a life where we can be together freely and honestly, then that is what I will do." The conviction in his voice left no room for doubt. He meant every word, and the realization filled Astrid with a fierce joy that was tempered by very real fear for what the future might hold. But in that moment, standing before the fire with Bjorn's hands gentle on her face and his eyes full of emotions he had hidden for so long, she allowed herself to hope, to believe that perhaps, despite everything, they might find a way to happiness together. "I am afraid," she admitted softly. "Afraid of the battle, afraid of what might happen after, afraid that I am dreaming and will wake to find this was all imagined." "It is not a dream," Bjorn assured her, and then, moving slowly to give her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was tender and careful and full of promise. It was the kiss of a man who had not touched a woman with affection in 5 years, uncertain but sincere, and Astrid felt her heart soar as she returned it, her hands coming up to rest against his broad chest where she could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Bjorn rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens in the coming days, know that you have given me something invaluable. You have reminded me what it is to feel, to hope, to want something beyond simple survival. For that gift, I will be forever grateful." They stood together by the fire for a long while, neither willing to break the spell of the moment. Eventually, practical concerns reasserted themselves, and they reluctantly separated, returning to their sleeping areas with promises to face whatever came together. But as Astrid lay on her bench, her fingers touching her lips where Bjorn had kissed her, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the furs piled over her. For the first time since her father had betrayed her, she felt genuinely happy. The next 10 days passed in a blur of frantic activity. The entire settlement mobilized for war, with every able-bodied person contributing to the preparations in whatever way they could. The warriors trained relentlessly, drilling in shield wall formations and practicing the coordinated movements that could mean the difference between victory and death. The blacksmiths worked day and night, repairing weapons and armor, forging new spearheads and axe blades. The women prepared food that could be stored, gathered medical supplies, and ensured that the children and elderly knew where to hide if the defenses were breached. Astrid threw herself into the work with desperate energy, as if by staying busy she could keep her fear at bay. She helped Helga prepare vast quantities of food for the warriors, rendered fat for treating wounds, and tore cloth into bandages. She sharpened Bjorn's weapons with meticulous care, oiled his armor until it gleamed, and made certain that every piece of his equipment was in perfect condition. If he was going to face death at the gate, she would at least ensure that his gear would not fail him. Bjorn spent almost all his waking hours at the training grounds or in war councils with the Jarl and other senior warriors. But in the evenings, when he returned to the longhouse exhausted and covered in sweat despite the cold, he would seek out Astrid's company. They would sit together by the fire, sometimes talking in low voices about their hopes and fears, sometimes simply sitting in comfortable silence, drawing strength from each other's presence. These stolen moments became precious to both of them, islands of peace in the mounting tension that gripped the settlement. On the night before the battle, when the full moon rose huge and pale over the mountains, casting everything in silver light, Bjorn came home earlier than usual. His face was grim with the weight of what tomorrow would bring, but his eyes softened when they found Astrid waiting for him. "The scouts have confirmed it," he said without preamble. "Ravensfjord and their allies will reach us by dawn. They are camping just beyond the ridge, 300 strong as we feared. Our allies from the north have arrived, giving us perhaps 200 warriors to stand against them. The odds are not good, but we will fight with everything we have." Helga, who had been preparing what might be the last meal she would cook in this house, set down her knife and came to embrace Bjorn with a fierceness that spoke of years of affection. "You will prevail," she said firmly, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You are Bjorn Ironside, and you have never been defeated. You will not fall tomorrow. I will do my best to make your faith justified," Bjorn replied, returning her embrace gently. "You have been like a mother to me these past years, Helga. If I fall, know that I have valued your service and your friendship more than I can say." "You will not fall," Helga repeated stubbornly, pulling back and wiping her eyes. "Now sit and eat. You need your strength for tomorrow." They ate together one last time, the three of them. Though the food tasted like ashes in Astrid's mouth, she could barely swallow past the lump in her throat, could barely think about anything, except the fact that in a few short hours, Bjorn would be standing at the gate with enemies trying to kill him. She had never felt fear like this before, had never understood how love could make one so vulnerable, so helpless in the face of forces beyond one's control. After the meal, Helga tactfully retired early, leaving Bjorn and Astrid alone by the fire. They sat close together on the bench, Astrid leaning against Bjorn's solid warmth, his arm around her shoulders. Neither spoke for a long time, simply taking comfort in the contact, in the knowledge that whatever happened tomorrow, they had found each other. "I have something for you," Bjorn said finally, reaching into the pouch at his belt. He pulled out a small object and placed it in Astrid's hand. It was a silver pendant on a leather cord, wrought in the shape of a wolf's head with intricate knotwork patterns. "This was my mother's," he explained quietly. "It is the only thing I have left from my family. I want you to have it, to keep safe for me. It will be my promise to you that I will return, that I will survive this battle and come back to build the future we spoke of." Astrid's hands trembled as she held the pendant, understanding the enormous significance of the gift. For Bjorn to give her his last connection to his lost family was a gesture of trust and commitment beyond anything she had expected. "I will guard it with my life," she promised, her voice thick with emotion, "and I will hold you to your promise to return." "There is something else," Bjorn said, turning to face her more fully. "Before I go to battle tomorrow, I want to do something that perhaps I should have done days ago. Astrid, Thorvald's daughter, I free you from your bonds as a thrall. You are no longer my property, no longer bound to this household by law. You are a free woman, with all the rights and privileges that entails." Astrid stared at him in shock, unable to process what she was hearing. But the debt, my father's obligation, is settled as far as I am concerned," Bjorn interrupted firmly. "I accepted you as payment, which satisfied the Jarl's requirements, but I will not go into battle tomorrow with you still bound in servitude. If I fall, I want you to be free to make your own choices, to build whatever life you can. And if I survive, I want what grows between us to be something you choose freely, not something you feel obligated to because I own you." Tears were streaming down Astrid's face now, hot and fast. "You do not have to do this. The risk, if the Jarl learns that you freed me, he may see it as defiance, as you rejecting his authority. Let him see it however he wishes," Bjorn said with fierce determination. "I have spent too many years living according to others' expectations, following orders without question, sublimating my own desires and needs for the sake of duty. I will not do it anymore, not with something this important. You deserve your freedom, and I will see that you have it, regardless of the consequences." He produced a document that he had clearly prepared in advance, written in the runic script used for legal matters, declaring Astrid's manumission and his relinquishment of all claims on her. It was signed with his mark and would be legally binding. He placed it in her hands along with a small pouch of silver. "This is enough to establish yourself if you need to leave Bjornstad," he explained. "Enough to buy passage to another settlement, to set yourself up with lodgings and supplies until you can find work. I hope you will not need to use it, that we will be able to move forward together after the battle. But I wanted you to have options, to have choices." Astrid could barely see through her tears, could barely speak past the overwhelming emotions that threatened to choke her. Never in her wildest imaginings had she expected this, had dreamed that Bjorn would sacrifice so much for her sake. "I love you," she said, the words bursting from her heart before she could stop them. I know it is too soon. I know I should not say such things, but I cannot hold it back any longer. I love you, Bjorn Ironside, and I will wait for you to return from this battle. I will be here when you come home. Bjorn pulled her into his arms, holding her with a desperate intensity that spoke of his own fears and feelings. I love you too, he murmured against her hair, his deep voice rough with emotion. I fought against it, tried to convince myself it was anything else, but the truth is undeniable. You have captured my heart, Astrid, in a way I never thought would happen again, and I swear to you by all the gods, I will survive tomorrow's battle. I will come back to you, and we will build a life together that is worth all we have endured to reach this moment. They kissed then, long and deep, pouring all their love and fear and hope into the contact. And later, they held each other through the long night, neither sleeping, both treasuring every moment they had left before dawn would come and tear them apart. The morning broke gray and cold, with mist rising from the fjord and obscuring the mountains. Astrid helped Bjorn into his armor with hands that only shook slightly, fastening each buckle with care, checking each strap to ensure it was secure. He looked magnificent and terrifying in his full battle gear, every inch the legendary warrior whose name was spoken with respect and fear throughout the region. But beneath the armor and weapons, she could still see the man who had kissed her so tenderly, who had freed her and promised to return. At the door, Bjorn turned back one last time. Remember your promise, he said to Astrid. Keep my mother's pendant safe. It will guide me back to you. I will, Astrid promised, clutching the silver wolf to her chest. And you remember yours. You swore you would survive. I will, Bjorn echoed, his gray eyes intense and unwavering. Then he was gone, striding out into the dawn with the confidence of a man who had faced death 100 times before and emerged victorious every time. The battle, when it came, was as brutal as everyone had feared. From the longhouse, Astrid could hear the clash of weapons, the screams of wounded men, the roar of warriors crying out their defiance against death. The sound went on for hours, rising and falling like terrible waves. And through it all, Astrid stood at the window with Helga beside her, both women rigid with terror and helpless fury at their inability to affect the outcome. The fighting was fiercest at the main gate where Bjorn commanded the shield wall. Wave after wave of Ravensfjord warriors threw themselves against the defenders, trying to break through by sheer force of numbers. But Bjorn held the line with iron discipline, his voice ringing out above the chaos, organizing the defense with the skill of a master tactician. When warriors fell beside him, he stepped forward to fill the gap. When the enemy surged forward with renewed fury, he met them with axe and sword, his legendary strength turning the tide again and again. By midday, the tide began to turn. The warriors of Bjornstad, inspired by Bjorn's courage and leadership, fought with desperate ferocity. The allied forces from the north, arriving fresh while the enemy was already exhausted, struck from the flank at a crucial moment. The Ravensfjord alliance began to crumble, their warriors falling back in disorder, then breaking entirely and fleeing toward the ships they had beached on the shore. When the victory horn finally sounded, announcing that the enemy had been routed and Bjornstad had held, Astrid nearly collapsed with relief. But the relief was short-lived, replaced immediately by desperate fear. Was Bjorn alive? Had he survived the terrible fighting at the gate? She ran from the longhouse without permission, her heart pounding, pushing through crowds of celebrating townspeople and wounded warriors being carried to the healing houses. The main gate was a scene of carnage, with bodies lying in heaps and the ground slick with blood. Warriors leaned on their shields, exhausted and wounded, their faces gray with fatigue. But she could not see Bjorn anywhere, could not find his distinctive height and build among the survivors. Terror clawed at her throat. Had he fallen? Was she too late? Then she heard his voice, that deep rumble she had come to love, calling out orders for the wounded to be carried inside and for the gate to be secured. She pushed through the last of the crowd and saw him, standing amidst the dead and dying, covered in blood, both his own and that of his enemies, but very much alive. He was leaning heavily on his sword, his left arm hanging at an odd angle that suggested injury, but his eyes were clear and alert as he directed the aftermath of the battle. "Bjorn!" she cried out, and his head snapped around at the sound of her voice. His stern warrior's expression transformed into something that might have been joy or relief or overwhelming love, probably all three at once. He took a step toward her, then another, and then she was running to him, throwing herself into his arms despite the blood and the pain it must have caused his injured arm. He held her with his good arm, pressing his face into her hair, and she felt him trembling with emotion and exhaustion. "You survived," she sobbed against his chest. "You kept your promise. I told you I would," he murmured, his voice hoarse from shouting orders all morning. "I had something precious waiting for me at home." I could not abandon her. They stood like that for a long moment, oblivious to the chaos around them, to the stares of other warriors, to everything except the overwhelming relief of being together and alive. Finally, Helga appeared, practical as always, and insisted on taking Bjorn to the healing house to have his wounds tended. The arm was broken but could be set, and his various cuts and bruises were painful but not life-threatening. He would heal. 3 days after the battle, when Bjorn's arm had been properly splinted and he had recovered somewhat from his exhaustion, Jarl Erik summoned him to the Great Hall. Astrid wanted to go with him, to stand beside him as he faced whatever consequences would come from his refusal to marry Ingrid. But Bjorn insisted she remain at the Longhouse. "This is between Erik and me," he said firmly. "I will not have you drawn into it more than you already are." He was gone for hours, and Astrid paced the Longhouse like a caged animal, imagining every possible terrible outcome. When Bjorn finally returned, his face was unreadable, giving nothing away. "What happened?" Astrid demanded, unable to bear the suspense another moment. Bjorn's stern expression suddenly cracked into a broad smile, the first truly joyful smile she had ever seen on his face. "Erik acknowledged that I saved the settlement. He admitted that without my leadership at the gate, Bjornstad would have fallen. In light of that service, he has agreed to release me from his expectation that I marry Ingrid. He was not pleased about it, and Ingrid was furious, but he is a pragmatic man. He knows he cannot afford to alienate his best warrior, especially now when his reputation and power have been strengthened by this victory." "Truly?" Astrid asked, hardly daring to believe it. "He will not punish you?" "Truly," Bjorn confirmed, crossing to her and pulling her into his arms carefully, mindful of his broken arm. "We are free, Astrid, free to build the life we want, here in Bjornstad, or anywhere else we choose." "I want to stay here," Astrid said, looking up into his beloved face. "This is your home, the place where you have built your reputation and your life. I will not be the reason you abandon it." "Then we stay," Bjorn agreed, "and we begin our new life together properly this time." He hesitated, then continued with unusual shyness for such a formidable warrior. "Astrid Thorvaldsdottir, free woman of Bjornstad, will you consent to be my wife? Will you marry me and share my home and my life for however many years the gods grant us?" Joy exploded in Astrid's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I will marry you and love you, and build a home with you that is filled with all the happiness we both deserve." They married 3 weeks later, when Bjorn's arm had healed enough to hold a cup of mead for the ceremony. It was a modest wedding by the standards of a warrior of Bjorn's status, but it was attended by many who had come to respect both him and Astrid. Helga wept openly throughout the ceremony, joy evident in every tear. Even some who had once scorned Astrid for being the daughter of Thorvald the Coward now acknowledged her as the wife of Bjorn Ironside, a woman who had proven her own strength and worth. Thorvald did not attend. He had left Bjornstad shortly after the battle, unable to face the shame of his daughter's elevation while his own reputation remained in ruins. Astrid felt a pang of sorrow for him, but she could not regret his absence. He had made his choices, and she had made hers. As the seasons turned and winter gave way to spring, Astrid and Bjorn built the life they had dreamed of during those desperate days before the battle. Their home was filled with laughter and warmth, with the companionship of equals who had chosen each other freely. Bjorn, who had been like stone for so many years, gradually softened, the light returning to his eyes and the joy returning to his heart. And Astrid, who had once been nothing more than payment for a debt, became the center of a household built on love and mutual respect. They spoke often of his first wife, honoring her memory without letting it overshadow their present happiness. Astrid wore the silver wolf pendant always, a reminder of the promise that had brought them together and the courage it had taken to claim their future. In the summer, Astrid discovered she was pregnant. When she told Bjorn, he wept for the first time since his first wife had died. But these were tears of joy rather than grief. They chose to name their daughter, when she arrived healthy and strong that autumn, Sigrid, after Astrid's mother. And later, they had sons who would grow strong like their father, learning both warrior skills and the deeper lesson that true strength lay in honoring those you loved. Years later, when they were old and gray, sitting by the fire in the longhouse that had witnessed so much of their story, Bjorn would take Astrid's hand and marvel at how far they had come from that terrible night when she had been brought to his door as payment for a debt. "I thought I had lost everything when my first Astrid died," he would say, his voice still deep and strong despite his age. "I thought I would never feel anything but emptiness for the rest of my days. But then you came, and you reminded me that the heart can heal, that love can be found again even in the darkest circumstances. You saved me, Astrid. You gave me back my life." And Astrid would smile, squeezing his weathered hand with her own, and reply with absolute certainty, "We saved each other, my love. We saved each other." Their story became legend in Bjornstad, told around fires on winter nights, the tale of the innocent woman given to a warrior as punishment for her father's cowardice, and the warrior who chose to honor her instead. It was a story of courage and redemption, of love strong enough to overcome impossible odds, and of the truth that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in the ability to conquer others, but in the willingness to open one's heart and love again after loss. And for generations after, when people spoke of Bjorn Ironside, they remembered not just his prowess in battle, but his capacity for love, and the woman who had awakened it.